Hey, I want to welcome you all back to the Orange Couch again today. I'm with Dad today, my dad, Gene Evans, and we're going to talk about a hot topic. So, this is the Orange Couch hot topic of money because I think it's coming from a pastor's perspective, it seems like we always get thrown under the bus about money. That's all we're about is here they go with another offering, taking up money. But you said something to me, Dad, the other day. We were talking and you said, tithing is a revelation. It's not just about, you know, taking up an offering or giving money, but it's a revelation. So give me your perspective. 77 years old, I'm 47. I was talking to Michael the other day just about tithing. He's a young man in his early 20s. And give us your perspective of money, tithing, how you've seen it work.
Well,
And
I think if you can ever understand tithing from a biblical standpoint and giving from a biblical standpoint, and it becomes a thing that's not something that we doing just because we feel like that you're supposed to give. There are in every in every scripture where we're told to give or to tithe. In every one of them, there's always a return connected to it. It's like in farming, if you plant a seed, you're going to get a harvest. I started tithing in 1963, and it started because my pastor stood up in the pulpit and said, "Today I'm going to teach on a tip or a tithe." And when he got through, I was under conviction because I thought, I'm tipping God. Big Sunday for me was $1 in the offering plate. And so I got under conviction. I said, man, I'm going to be a tither. I want to be a tither. So I go home, talk to my wife, and I said, we need to start tithing. And she said, well, that's fine with me. And I said, well, let me see if we can afford to tithe. So I got out all my bills, and at this point I was a CPA, and I prepared what we CPAs would call a cash flow statement. I'm going to see, can we afford to tithe? So I got through with that, and I was devastated. I didn't realize I was so bad off. I thought, dear God, we can't afford to tithe. I need to get my dollar back. We can't even afford to give $1. But I stayed under conviction, and basically on the topic that he was preaching, he used Malachi 3, where it said, bring all the tithes into the storehouse and prove me. And that word prove me kind of stuck with me. Prove me. God was saying to us, prove me and see if I won't do something about the tithe. And so I struggled with that for a few days, and finally I just said, well, I'm going to, actually I had the idea I was going to prove to God it wouldn't work because I've got it on paper. I've proved that I can't tithe. I've absolutely guaranteed naturally I can't tithe. But I wrote out my first tithe check in 1963. I believe it was in November of 1963. And since that date, I've never missed a tithe.
wow.
And I've never missed paying a bill.
Wow.
It's supernatural.
Yeah, let me ask you a question then. I grew up in the home watching you tithe, hearing you talk about it, hearing our church talk about it. But then, here comes the first kid, second kid, third kid, fourth kid. And I know even from my perspective, there's the challenge of sitting there looking at a checkbook, having the thought of, I've got to pay a gas bill, a power bill, a car payment, a college payment, a credit card payment, a house payment. Surely God could just hold off a while and God will let me slide here. How did you deal with those kind of thoughts of, well, it's God. He's not going to get on to me and I can let it slide. Did you ever have to deal with those kind of thoughts, and how did you work through those practically?
Well, I think I just got into it accidentally in that I made a commitment. I'm going to tithe. I'm going to prove it doesn't work.
So your whole motivation is, I'm proving it doesn't work.
Right. So when it would look like I couldn't pay it, I think, well, I'll show him. I'm going to put my tithe in. But I never came to the place that I couldn't pay my bills. So I believe as a Christian now, knowing what I know about the Bible, if you can come to the conclusion, God cannot lie. And if he said, if you'll tithe, I'll not only open the windows of heaven and pour blessings out upon you, but he said, I'll rebuke the devourer for your sake, and your vine won't cast its fruit before the time. So then you approach every situation not from a natural perspective that I've got a gas bill, I've got to put my kids through school, I've got to buy a car. You approach it, if I tithe, God has obligated himself to get involved with my finances. But if I do it from a natural standpoint and I say, well, I can't afford to tithe because I've got to pay a car payment,
Sure.
then we have to do it. But if you can see, if you do tithe, then God obligates himself on your behalf.
Yeah, I think that's the thing that, really touches my heart, is that I had the chance to not only grow up watching you as a pastor, but watching you live it out while you preached it, and watching you, because I think that's, in a whole nother realm of thinking of, rather than doing what I think most people, how they tithe is, I'm going to prove that it works, and if I give 20, God's going to give me back 30. And if I give, and here you are from the total opposite perspective of, I'm going to prove it doesn't work, and you can't. Your honest testimony is you could not, from 1960s to 2013, prove that it doesn't work.
It has worked every time. And if, in the natural, I would have had to come to a place where I couldn't pay my bills.
Right.
But I never reached that place.
That's super.
I never had a bill I couldn't pay. But if I'd looked at it from a natural standpoint, it was impossible for me to do that. And once you go through that initial insight, well, God is going to get involved with my finances, then you begin to not tithe because it's an obligation. You tithe because, it's a joyful way to put God in your finances and in your life in a supernatural way. So I prove that not only with tithing, but also in giving. I accidentally got pushed into giving when we joined the Tabernacle, which was a Pentecostal revival center, and we had these evangelists coming in, and they would receive offerings, and they'd always say, well, I was praying, and God told me somebody was going to give me $100 in the offering. And of course, back in the 60s and early 70s, $100 would be like $500 today. And I would think, well, if God doesn't speak to somebody else, he must be speaking to me. So if nobody volunteered, then I'd raise my hand and say, well, I'll give the $100. And, you can do that one or two times, but when you're having, back in those days, we would be in revival for 17 nights in a row. And if you give $100 17 nights in a row, you've given beyond your ability to give. But instead of going under, I always went up. Yeah. And so I proved not only does tithing work, but giving is a supernatural way to live.
Yeah, I think that's what, as a pastor, myself in ministry, I always had this guilt trip of, I don't want to stand in the pulpit and talk about money and talk about tithing because people are going to think I'm a money grubber or money hungry. But in reality, I really saw that if I don't share this truth with people, I'm robbing them. We share truths about health and fitness and multi-level marketing and businesses and coffee that's touched me, a restaurant that's changed my life. And I think the one thing I've seen that you've laid footprints to me is that there's no denying tithing works today. Let's say, here we are, 2013, fast forward 50-something years later. We're in a bad economy, so to speak. Gas prices are high. Folks are coming out of college struggling how to find a job, hurting, may have lost their home, may have had to let their house go. Practically, where can they start in this starting to get out? Because a lot of people think, well, if I get this bill paid off, then what would your advice be today, 2013, of starting a lifestyle of giving and a lifestyle of tithing?
Well, I would start out, first of all, by tithing, even if I couldn't see a way to tithe, knowing what I know now. Of course, I know somebody, just getting started, they don't have the faith that I would have because, I've been living it for 50-something years, and I know it works, and I've seen it work. But I don't believe you can ever really come to a place where you trust God unless you take a step that if God doesn't move, I'm in trouble. I'm going to go under. And I think every person that's going to live by faith has to get outside the natural and get into the supernatural. And the quickest way to get in the supernatural is to tithe when you can't afford to tithe. When if you looked at it from a natural standpoint, you've got to make a car payment, a house payment, or do something. You know, there's always something you've
Sure.
got to do with your money. But if you say the first 10% of my paycheck belongs to God, and I'm not going to spend it, I want to give it to God, then God has obligated himself. Okay, I'll open the windows of heaven, and I'll pour you out a blessing that there shall not be room to receive it. And not only that, but I'll rebuke the devourer for your sake, and your vine won't cast its fruit before the time. So that moves you immediately into a supernatural lifestyle. And if you never see God as a supernatural God, then you go through life living a Christian life in a natural way, and you get disappointed because you can't live the Christian life naturally with victory.
That's great.
Because the only thing you do is get frustrated.
Right.
But if you decide, if this thing's not going to work, I want to find out early. Because, you know, I tell people, if Christianity is not a reality, if you can't trust God to do what he says he'll do, then we shouldn't give our life to it. We ought to give our life to opening a pool hall or doing something, because there's no reality there.
Right.
But the very moment you say, if God doesn't come through, I'm sunk, then you have to trust God. And if you don't know God can be trusted, you've got to prove you can trust God. And I think the easiest way for anyone to start is to start tithing.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. One thought I have closing out the whole thinking of living it out with you and Mom is that when you said, prove me and see if I want to open the windows of heaven, and then that phrase, and rebuke the devourer, here you are, 77 years old, great health, perfect health, never been in the hospital, never been sick, had 20/20 vision, Mom's in perfect health. So I don't think tithing, from my perspective, has just been a give money to get money back or give money to get a need met. It literally, like you said, is supernatural. It's affected your health. It's affected your life. It's affected your kids who walk in the blessings of God that's been established. And so that's a powerful truth. But thank you for being here and helping us today and sharing with us some truth. I want to welcome you back again soon. Come check out the Orange Couch. God's doing a lot of good stuff. Have a great day.